apart from that, I think I also see a totalitarian pulse. This ideology has a lot of pre-totalitarian reflex. This cancel culture, the moral superiority. They don't hesitate to silence and to muzzle those who do not agree with them. So
if the European Commission had to be described in a single word, technocracy would come fittingly close. Commissioners and EU civil servants are selected on the basis of subject matter expertise to carry out the thanklessly tiresome tasks of patching together the bloc's budget, governing its single market, and negotiating trade deals on behalf of the 27 member states. Culture wars, on the contrary, are too scrappy, too militant for the EU's executive arm to get embroiled in. Or are they? The notion that the Great Awokening unfolding across the West since the death of George Floyd on police custody in May last year may have spared the high echelons of the EU's bureaucracy was swiftly dispelled the week of November 28th with a scoop courtesy of Il Giornale. The Italian daily Unveiled, the Commission's so-called Guidelines for Inclusive Communication, an effort spearheaded by Commissioner for Equality Helena Dalli, and meant to be binding on all of the Commission's internal and external communications. The document sought to forbid from use such unwoke expressions as Merry Christmas, ladies and gentlemen, homosexual, or even citizen deemed offensive to stateless refugees. Rodrigo Ballester worked at the heart of the Commission's sprawling apparatus for 7 years, notably in the cabinet of former Hungarian Commissioner Tibor Navracsics, before leaving Brussels for Budapest, where he now leads the Center for European Studies at Mathias Corvinus Collegium. Brice Couturier is a best-selling French author and journalist. A proud boomer, Mr. Couturier is also terrified by the grip of wokeness on mainstream culture, and he has written about it in his latest book, Ok Millenials, Puritanism, Victimization, Tdentitarianism, Censorship, a baby boomer's survey of the woke generation's founding myths. Now we are so glad to have with us this week Misters Ballester and Couturier to unpack whether and how wokeness has permeated the European Union. As always, please rate and subscribe to the show on your favorite platform, and consider donating however much you can on Patreon at patreon.com/undecencypod so that we can better afford our digital and physical presence. Now, on to the show.
To cover this important conversation, we are very glad to have with us Rodrigo Ballester from Spain. You're the head of a Center for European Studies at the Mathias Corvinus Collegium in Budapest, and a former Eurocrat, a EU civil servant. And on the other side of the line in France, we've got Brice Couturier. Brice, you're a veteran French journalist and the author of the acclaimed Ok Millenials, Puritanism, Victimization, Tdentitarianism, Censorship, a study of a baby boomer on the myths of the woke generation. I think that's a good place to start with. Brice, before we start this conversation, let's lay the groundwork. Could you define in a few words, give us a working definition of wokeism, and what are some of the key concepts for this conversation?
Yeah, of course. The word woke comes from the Black Lives Matter American movement. In fact, it was a documentary, an American television one, around Jesse Williams, which was made in 2016 called Stay Woke. And it showed how the movement took speed after one more young black man was killed by the American police. So at the start, it's all about racism and what is now called racial justice. But the meaning of the word, in my opinion, changed, morphed, if you like, and now it sounds like keep being alert toward what they call structural inequalities, differences in outcomings between black and whites, men and women, and so on. And in my opinion, it relates very deeply to what the Americans and the British call the Great Awakening, a movement of religious Protestant revival which reached the future United States in the beginning of the 18th century. Because there is something deeply religious in this movement. It's a kind of religious revival from the left, from the radical left, precisely because people who plead for the woke thing are deeply uncompromising and self-righteous. Woke is basically the same thing as identity politics. It's something very puritanical in the way you're supposed to confess your privileges if you happen to be white or male or both. Our problem is that it became the established face of the American academics and mainly of the ruling corporate elites as well. So it's something at the beginning very American because we didn't have anything like slavery in Western Europe. Our countries are not based on Jim Crow laws as they got in the South of America until the 60s. We have not the same historical past, but the Americans want to import this kind of thing in our countries because it's a part of their soft power, if you like, to use our youth against our own culture and politics. Our history is very different from the American one, so I would prefer they keep their own problems at home, and we have our problems, and they are different. And work has nothing to do with our culture, our political tradition, or our social problems. Our problems are most of all for me. The most critic I have to do against wokeism is that in America you've got incredible high level of social and economic inequalities that we don't have in France at all. We have the same level of inequalities during the last 30 years. If you take the real the real thing, the top 10 level is the top last decade. You can see it's very stable in the time because we are a social democracy. They don't have it in America, so they use this woke thing as a way to hide the reality of deeply social and economic inequalities. The woke thing is simply that a part of the black community or the women are able to join the economic elites, and so everybody is happy. We are not happy with this kind of system here. We want more equality, real equality. They are on a cultural war and a cultural fight. We prefer the socio-economic fight as a political battleground.
Brice, before we pivot to the EU a little bit, just one last question. What do you say to the people that there is no distinction between what you call wokeism and traditional progressivism, and that you would have opposed civil rights, for example, in the 1960s?
Yeah, that's the main point of my book. It's why I wanted to present myself as a baby boomer, as a boomer, which what I am. I'm very tired with conservative critics in my country saying it's your sons and daughters. No, they are not. We were, when we were fighting for civil rights around the world, we were fighting for international solidarity, and we were more or less influenced by socialist ideas. So we wanted equality, and we didn't fight for ourselves. And it was not about identity politics. It was international solidarity. And what the wokes are doing is fighting for their own little identities and sub identities all the time. Because if you're a woman, it's not enough. You have got to be a black woman. Black woman is almost a bit privileged too. So you have to be a lesbian black woman. But if you are ableist, if you are not on an armchair, you're not enough oppressed. So you have to be a disabled black lesbian woman. It's more and more defending your little position in the society, and it's not about solidarity for all. It's not about citizenship. It's about identity politics. It has nothing to do with the movement of the 60s. It has nothing to do with Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King was fighting for the same rights for everybody. Not he told we told us, and it's a lesson I took at the time. I don't want my children to be judged on the color of their skin, but on their character. And for me, it's the main thing. Woke want people to be judged according to the color of their skin. And I am colorblind. I don't care if you got a black skin or blonde hair. For me, you are a human being. I don't care if you are a man or woman. I want equality between all. I don't want special rights for certain people according to the so-called miseries they've got in the past or their ancestors got. It's completely different from the 60s, the ideals of my youth. We were anti-racist. They pretend to be anti-racist, but they are deeply racist. They think that color of skin means a culture, and a culture means a politics. I don't want. I don't want. I cannot buy that in my own country.
Rodrigo?
Yes, thank you first of all, and I very much subscribe to all the points of the definition that were given by Brice Couturier. I just wanted to add maybe two things. That apart from that, I think I also see a totalitarian pulse. This ideology has a lot of pre-totalitarian reflex. You know, this cancel culture, this moral superiority. This they don't hesitate to silence and to muzzle those who do not agree with them. So there is a clear totalitarian pulse where I see actually a huge danger, and I also see it as an intellectual regression. I mean, what Brice Couturier says is absolutely right. It's really the opposite, the antipode of some of the fights of the 60s. The best example is the one that he gave already, which is the color blindness of Martin Luther King. If you remember this mythical speech of Gebre Selassie in the Nation Society that then was put into music by Bob Marley in the song War. I say, until the color of a man's skin is no longer important than the color of its eyes, I have to say war. And this is exactly the mathematical opposite of what the critical race theory and the wokeism is promoting in the US for sure. And it's true that it's also, I would say, an intellectual disease that is typical of white elites, white liberal elites. It's spread by them. It is undergone also by them. It's a very narcissist as well ideology, and it's true that if I had to find some precedents in history, I think that some Calvinist movements, for example, some Puritan movements of the 16th, 17th century could maybe provide a good precedent.
And well, thank you so much for setting up the table so nicely here by fleshing out the philosophical underpinnings that structure the worldview. And this is going to be really useful context as we move forward with the conversation. And in fact, precisely the reason we're having this conversation is because we're reeling at the end of a news cycle that has been rife with controversy, and particularly controversy around a set of internal documents that have been disclosed, documents that have been shared by some EU institutions and that purported to defend the values of equality and diversity, but which, in point of fact, are worryingly akin to woke diktats. And I was wondering, Rodrigo, can you take us here, and can you walk us through exactly what has happened? What were these documents about? You know, you spend much of your career as an EU civil servant, working in some of these institutions, in the Parliament, the Commission. What has been brewing here in the EU, and what are these what are these woke documents about?
Thank you, Jorge. You had basically in the last 6 weeks, basically two huge controversies that really made it to the headlines, of the press, especially actually in France. The first one was a campaign that was run by the Council of Europe, which is not technically speaking the European Union, it's another organization, but it was also backed and sponsored by the European Union the European Commission, to be more concrete. And it was a campaign about, let's say, a happy hijab. So it was portraying the hijab, the Islamic veil, as a symbol of beauty, of diversity, and of happiness and of freedom. And they were doing that with exactly the same codes and the same line to take, the same communication tips that are used, by a lot of Muslim NGOs that are very close to the Muslim Brothers. And they were doing that also with a mix of naivete and dogmatism at the same time. So that created a huge controversy in France. It really triggered a huge one, and they corrected and they withdrew also this campaign very quickly. And when we thought that the lesson was learned, a couple of weeks later, actually, it was beginning of November, and then the scandal was released end of November. But an Italian journal published an internal document that were the European Commission guidelines on inclusive communication. And so it was like a little workbook of how the civil servants of the European Commission are supposed to communicate outside. So when they organize an event, when they write a paper, when they organize a conference, but also somehow inside, indoors. It was supposed to be recommendations. Most of them were recommendations. Some of them were more than recommendations. And the problem came as well from the fact that it went extremely far. It's a text that gives a list of examples, and most of them are very, very dogmatic. It's really like for professional wokes, if I may say. And some of them were actually very controversial. I just quote you maybe the three, four that are most controversial and most ridiculous and grotesque as well. Is that first of all, no one was supposed to say any more ladies and gentlemen when you open a speech. The second was that you cannot even say that Christmas period is stressful. You're supposed to replace Christmas by a vacation. So even when you are having a coffee in the commission with your colleagues, you cannot say, "Oh my God, I have a lot of work at Christmas." You have to say, "Oh, I have a lot of work for the vacations." Then you also had another example that I found obviously very shocking is that they don't recommend to say citizen, for example. So don't address Europeans as citizens, because if you use the word citizen, you might be discriminating stateless and irregular migrants. And then there was another example as well that's really sparked a lot of laugh and memes and things like that. Is that if you want to portray a family, an international couple, don't use usual names, Christian names like John and Mary, but rather use Julio and Malika, which, by the way, for Spanish people is a nonsense, because Julio is as Christian and as traditional as John can be. So I think maybe they had Julio Iglesias in mind or something like that. And and then so it was leaked, and it created a huge controversy in Italy, in Spain, in France, in Hungary, in Poland. And the commission reacted very quickly and again withdrew those guidelines. So just to discharge a bit the European Commission on that. First, it reacted very quickly. Second, it's true that the Commission is a place where sometimes the right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing. And a lot of EU civil servants were not even aware of the existence of this document and were not consulted. And also, it's not the only one. The Parliament, European Parliament, also adopted their similar guidelines 2 years ago or 3 years ago. I don't remember. Same thing with the European Council, and no one ever criticized them. So sometimes, controversies and scoops can be a bit unfair, and in this case, the Commission was really like the lightning rod that attracted all the criticism, when actually, the Parliament and the Commission and the Council are not doing any better.
Brice, what do you make of those examples of controversies? Is that a perfect illustration of wokeism that you describe in your book?
Well, in the weekly I'm working on new weekly called Franc-Tireur, in which
Yep.
I'm involved. We published an inquiry and investigation about the infiltration of Islamism inside the European institutions, and we have proofs that these Islamist lobbies have succeeded in infiltrating some European institutions on the pretext of fighting against hate and discrimination, of promoting diversity. They got power and they got money. Yes, I admit that the Council of Europe has nothing to do with the European Union, but it's a loose organization of 47 countries, but it plays a role in promoting human rights in Europe because it includes the European Human Rights Court. What the people who have been investigation for our magazine, our weekly, about this case is that 340,000 euros have been devoted to the promotion of the respect of diversity and inclusion by the department in charge. But the department was looking for referees, and it found these referees in associations linked to the Muslim Brotherhood. And as you know, the members of the Muslim Brotherhood are in jails in many Muslim countries like Egypt, but they are free to raise money and campaigning in Europe. So you've got something called the European Forum of Muslim Women. These associations are fighting for separate swimming pools for men and women. They teach suspicion towards sciences as it's taught in our schools. They criticize Darwinism, by example. They are very hostile toward feminism or gay rights. And for me, it's something very surprising that the woke movement, which is so keen on women's rights, on gay and lesbian rights, are supporting at the same time these kind of extremely conservative Islamic associations who are fighting against the gender theory. It's something very incredible. It's why something like Islamo-Gauchism is so surprising for everybody, because you've got an incredible alliance between the most conservative part of our society and the most progressive. What they have in common, by God's sake? Nothing at all, but they've got the same aim, which is to criticize our liberal societies because they don't like it the way it is. Um, it's they seem unable to understand that in our culture, it's something very French. You know, we've got what we call laïcité, and it took years and years of fights between the state and the church, the Christian churches, the Catholic one especially. You are free by these laws to join any religion you like, but you are free to leave it as well. And in Islam, it's not the same. In our laicite system, your identity is your civic citizenship, and it is not your religion. I understand that in a lot of Muslim countries, it's not the same way. Your religion is your identity. So I understand that for many Muslim people, if you criticize their religion, it's like criticizing themselves because they identify with their religion. But they have to understand that in Western Europe, and especially in France, it's not the same. You can make jokes about special beliefs. It doesn't account for an attack against you as a person or as a believer. We've got laws who forbid racism, who forbid attacks on people because of their religion. But we are free to criticize religions because religions are for us opinions like political beliefs. There is nothing different between a religion or a political belief. I think we are free to say that liberalism is a bad thing, or that social democracy is a bad thing, or communism is a bad thing. We are free to do that. So we have to be free to say that some religions are stupid, some beliefs are backward, and we have the right to make jokes about them. It took a century for us to make us free to say that some religious tenets of the Christian religions are really ridiculous, and we want to have the same rights towards the Islam religion because it's just a religion and nothing more.
And Brice, thank you so much for pointing to this juncture here between woke politics in one hand and Islamism on the other. I think it's an incredibly important issue, so thanks for raising it. This is, in fact, even a point of terminology. French, the French language, has a term for this, or at least, we've been trying to essentially talk this into becoming an issue with the term Islamo-gauchisme, whereas English doesn't really quite have the same term. In fact, Francois and myself, I think, can reasonably pretend to have come up with the fairest translation. We call it the woke Islamist pincer movement, or the woke Islamist axis. But here, I think what Brice is pointing out is that the EU institutions, under the pretense of fighting discrimination, have fallen prey to Islamist ideology, which is a very discriminatory ideology when you think of it. And turning back to Rodrigo, in fact, Helena Dalli, the commissioner, the same commissioner who had commissioned the diversity report that you have just walked us through earlier, she has also been meeting with some of the Islamist-linked organizations that Brice has mentioned, like FEMISO, like the European Network Against Racism, like the European Muslim Network. Why do you think, Rodrigo, that this is happening in the EU? Is it because the EU is very opaque? Is it because it has a lot of money and it doesn't know what to do with it? Why is the EU falling prey to something that at the national level we all are keeping a close eye on, essentially Islamism? Whether you look at Germany or France, these countries are very aware that Islamism is an issue. Why isn't the EU, in your view?
Yeah, good question. But for example, I wouldn't say that the UK, for example, speaking about another European country, is paying the same attention. Huh? When I see also like the level of acceptance of wokeism and identity politics among, for example, Anglo-Saxon elites, but including the European Anglo-Saxon elites, I think they're closer maybe to what the European Union sees and think and says than actually what is happening in France, for example, now. So yes, no, the only thing in common that Muslim brothers and LGBTI, queer, whatever lobbies have, there's only one element that I found is that both are minorities, and that's essential. So they have nothing else in common, it's true, except that they are minorities as compared to the traditional statute. I think wokeism as well, it's at the end it boils down to a self-hatred, self-loathing. It's a deeply anti-Western movement. It's about hating anything that your culture and your civilization produced in the last 2000 years, basically. And so at the end, all those who are not within this mainstream are good, and those who are within the mainstream are bad. And they're not looking to for more intellectual coherence or consistency than that. Coming back to the European Union and why they are so receptive, to this ideology, I also wanted to add something, is that what happened with the guidelines on inclusive communication, that was not a mistake. It was not une gaffe, as we say in French. It was not like a typo. No, it was more the cherry on the cake. Since in the last 2 years and a half, since actually Mrs. von der Leyen Commission took power, there was a clear bet for a woke ideology, in not only in private and in internal documents, but also in external public policy documents. Look, for example, at the Commission strategy on LGBTQ, on racism, and also on gender. You can find really like the stop of the wokeism jargon. For example, I just give you some examples, but you can find in Commission policy papers that human resources professionals will participate in mandatory trainings on unconscious bias. So all the HR in the European Communion have to participate on training on unconscious bias. They also speak, for example, about the principle, they will boost the principle of self-determination, so gender self-determination, so that's more like a trans question, without age restriction. They speak also about the unconscious bias that needs also to be tackled, even in algorithms. They say, for example, that racism is often deeply embedded in our society's history, intertwined with its cultural roots and norms. And so let me also bounce back to what Brice Couturier said at the beginning, that this woke ideology is very American and has nothing to do with our culture and our history. Well, please go and explain that to the European Commission, because look at what they're saying. They also speak about intersectionality, time and again. Time and again, they speak. They praise the Black Lives Matter. They say, for example, that discrimination is often multidimensional, and only an intersectional approach can pave the way to sustainable and respectful changes in society. And I spare you the others. Why is that? Why are they so receptive to this ideology and to such a great extent? It's difficult to say, but the way that the woke ideology is spread from the head, from the elites, I think the same process is also happening here. We are speaking about persons who are very much in touch with lobbies, and with NGOs, with civil society. The importance of NGOs in the European Union is decisive, and is all the more important that obviously EU civil servants, EU bureaucrats are far away from the ground. Every bureaucrat might be far away from the ground, but one in a city hall is less far away from the ground. One at national level is still far, but not as far as European, maybe. That's automatic. It's fatal. That's the way it is. And so at the end, I think that quite a lot of people in the European Union tend to come to confuse civil society with society full stop. And so at the end, when you only speak to representative of minorities and you confuse them with the majority, you can, actually step on those red lines. Again, I think wokeism also builds its strength on ignorance, especially ignorance of history. And history, is not a discipline that is very well represented into the European elites today, or the international elites in general. They are mostly lawyers, economists, but they lack, like this historical culture that will prevent them sometimes to have, to fall so easily into the traps, for example, of the happy hijab campaign. Um, and so I think those are two factors that can explain partially the phenomenon. But there's a part of mystery as well. How is it possible today that the best universities in the planet, the best ones, totally fell into the woke trap? And so basically, the smartest people in the galaxy, and so I don't have a clear answer for that. How is it possible that the richest multinationals in the planet are siding with an ideology that has clear Marxist roots? Sorry, I don't get it neither. So there's a part, of craze, of an intellectual epidemics that I cannot totally explain. So there, I must say that there is a part of mystery there. But again, it's a fact. The European elites, and especially I would say in the Commission and in the European Parliament, totally assumed already and embraced the words and the content and the meaning of this ideology, and is very much pushing it forward, whether they have inclusive guidelines for internal communication or not.
If I may just bounce off what Rodrigo said and ask Brice. Brice, I think you're pretty publicly a very pro-European figure in the French national conversation. How do you feel about this institution, this organization, which you cherish and love, and also see the kind of infiltration it's seen? How do you explain this kind of tension?
Well, what strikes me the most is that in the present context of the Euroscepticism, with Great Britain leaving us, some of the people in Europe having more and more, let me say, doubts about European integration. The fact that this kind of infiltration is coming at the top of the European institutions are very bad news for people like me who supported from the start is the idea of European integration. I've been living in Poland during 3 years, and I remember how people there were making fun about this kind of strange American ideas like women's studies or black studies in Warsaw, where when I was there, there was absolutely nobody who was black, but they got the black studies there too, because it's the American thing, and they had to have it too. So people there at the start they reacted with fun, as I said, but more and more they became tired of this propaganda coming from outside because it has nothing to do with them, and it's one of the reasons why one of the causes where why people start to criticize Europe and losing faith in the movement of integration I was supporting. So for me, again, it's a very bad sign when you realize that you put your face. But one thing I want to add, because I'm very happy of what Rodrigo Ballester said, but there is one thing I have to do as a Frenchman, I have to say, is that my government, Macron's government, is very clear about fighting against wokeism. Our Minister of Education, Blanquer, is a very decisive against this propaganda coming from from Europe, from the European institutions, and it's because France protested, because the French government protested against this campaign, that it was suppressed. Another thing I wanted to add is that when I see European institutions supporting campaigns saying that hijab it's just a women's dress as miniskirt or having long or black hair. No, it's not. I'm following on Twitter and other social networks women fighting against hijab in Iran or other Islamic countries. I support them very strongly because I'm a feminist. And I realize that in some countries, hijab is not something like a fashion, a trend, or something funny that you can take or leave. No, it's something it's imposed on you because you're a woman and because you are a terrible temptation for men. So you have to hide yourself. And it's something I've been fighting against since I've been young in the 60s. And I will always fight against it because I think women have the right to dress as they want in the streets and not they don't have to hide themselves because they are wonderful. And when you support hijab campaigns in Europe, it's a kind of um, uh, injury against women who are fighting against hijab in Iran. You know what I mean? You can in the same way saying that hijab is wonderful in Europe and it's awful in Iran. No, it's awful everywhere. Against I'm very happy that this government has been taking a very strong stand on this affair. I hope it will be followed because a lot of governments in Europe, in Western Europe, are afraid to protest against, even if they know very well that it's a bad thing that this Islamist institution is the Islamist associations are infiltrating European institutions. They know it's bad, but they're afraid of protesting because they think they will be accused of being Islamophobe or racist. Even in France, we don't have this. At least this government has not these. Is not afraid of saying his mind, telling his mind about this thing. And it's supported by the society, especially, I have to add that, especially by people from immigration from the Maghreb. We've got a lot of people coming in, French people coming from Algeria. In Algeria, they saw 200,000 people killed in a terrible civil war between Islamists and the military, and they don't want to have the same thing here. So they warned us from the start. Don't let the Islamists, don't let the bearded men and the veiled women taking the streets in this country, because we knew that we saw this film before in our country where we're coming from, Algeria. We saw that. And we don't want to have the same thing in France because we came here to be peaceful, to live peacefully. We don't want this war. So I think it's one of the one of the things Americans cannot understand, because they don't have hundreds of thousands of citizens coming from Algeria or other countries where the Islamists have taken power or have fought civil wars. They want to. They don't have this in America. They don't. They don't know. We have it here. We know because we have these people of citizens or citizens coming from Islamist countries, and we've got a lot of Iranian women too exiled, as my friend Abnoush Salmani, who wrote beautiful books about how it's terrible to be a woman in Iran. You know, so it's a part of the thing, that it's a part of the picture the wokes don't see and don't want to see. As,
Um,
you know.
Brice and Rodrigo, you both seem to agree that this woke ideology is negative for the EU. But I want to push back a little bit. There was an interesting article from the Washington Post correspondent in Paris, James Macaulay. He also published a very good book recently called The House of Fragile Things on art and under Nazi era. But he published a very long article in The Nation, which is entitled Europe's War on the Woke, where he argues that wokeism is really a phenomenon of the Anglosphere. The social justice movement has gained far less traction than it has in US cultural institutions. Yet, Europe has gone fully anti-woke, even without much wokeness to fight. Rodrigo, are you fighting a scapegoat or maybe a straw man here? Are you punching in the air?
Allow me to lend some vocabulary to the wokes. I think some wokes suffer from a woke unconscious bias. Huh? And maybe from their woke privilege or something like that. I mean, maybe this journalist can ask to Sabine Procoris what happened 6 days ago in Paris Descartes, in the university where she was cancelled. She can ask about all the intellectuals that in France, in Germany, in Spain, in many other places of Western Europe have been cancelled. And also, it might be right for Eastern and Central Europe. Those are countries that are absolutely not sensitive to the woke ideology, and where this woke ideology is absolutely minoritarian for the time being. And probably they are vaccinated against that because, when you spend 45 years under a communist regime, that looks very much like, had at least the same cultural reflexes and ticks and tones than the communist regime, you are somehow vaccinated. But in Western Europe, I mean, look at the state of the universities in many European Western states. Saying maybe this journalist can also ask the two teachers in Sciences Po Grenoble, who have been not only cancelled by the students, but whose names have been actually spread on the social networks, and they were until recently under police protection because of that. And not only under police protection, it's that all that the students that were responsible for that have been absolutely forgiven by the authorities. When you have a French government that is basically taking official positions against the infiltration of woke ideology, I guess they're doing that seriously. So, of course, to deny the existence of this of woke ideology is again, a very mental mechanism that is very a propaganda mechanism rather that is very similar to the one of communism. Of course, they are accusing you of something that they are and you are not, but they still do it. So no, it's almost insulting to say that. And again, I think some journalists suffer from a woke unconscious bias, or maybe it's conscious, I don't know. Just coming back to the French government, it's true that they're taking clear steps. It's also true that sometimes they have more ambiguous positions. I'm referring here, for example, to the fact that President Macron once said that, yeah, there was indeed a white privilege in France, which I think it's irresponsible. And also the Minister of Education, Blanquer, who took very, very clear positions against the woke ideology, but that also, for example, did a little an administrative document, drafted and adopted an administrative document to make sure that the schools adapt to trans students. And the trans ideology, and I use the words consciously, ideology is probably one of the most toxic within the woke galaxy. And it was surprising for me to see that one of the ministers that said very, very clearly what he thinks about the woke ideology and how noxious it can be. It was surprising for me to see that actually on that specific point, he totally abided and totally adopted the woke positions.
Brice, do you want to answer this point or do you want to move on? Your call.
No, I think Rodrigo is right. Inside our ministries, you've got administrations which go have a free will, and sometimes ministers don't control everything coming from their administration. Rodrigo is very right when he says that the trans ideology those days is really the most frightening of all the woke thing. And for me, the most interesting thing is that intersectionality is really a myth. When you realize that some very historical hardline feminists in England, especially, are now obliged to resign because they're attacked as turf, as they call
Trans
the
exclusionary
transers.
radical feminists.
Yeah, that's it. And you can see that some of these feminists have been obliged very recently to resign from their position in the university because simply they said that women have a specific body, and that you can do everything you want. You cannot become completely a woman. You can pretend to be one. You have the right to be treated as a one, but there are some things like the J.K. Rowling books were burned really recently in some universities because she said that women have special organism. That's all. She didn't say that she hated trans. But trans people, trans lobby took it as if it was an attack against them, just to remind people that women are women and men are men. It's crazy. No, okay, but we yeah. No, I have nothing else to add as to what Rodrigo Ballester said.
She actually, J.K. Rowling is no longer invited to the Harry Potter reunion, which I thought was a bit ungrateful, considered that she gave a lot of people a job for a very long time. Now, let's move on a little bit to one last, I think, counterattack, which has to be taken seriously, which is Europe does not have America's racial history. That is undeniable, and I think despite all the attempts of some so-called anti-racists, the racial history of Europe and America is very different. Nonetheless, there is one thing which I think we haven't talked about much, and we would be at a fault if we didn't talk about. It is the legacy of colonialism. Undeniably, Europe, through colonialism, has shaped history, has shaped Africa, sometimes in some pretty tragic and terrifying ways. What do you say to people that we have a colonial mindset which subsides to our societies nowadays, and that we are kind of ignoring the fact that brown and black people in our countries are not treated the same way? Brice.
Yeah, I can buy that. Except one thing, I see that in Sweden or in Norway, where I've been traveling recently, they've got an immigration problem, um, at least similar to ours, and they never took any colonies in Africa or anywhere else in the world, but they um, meet the same problems as we do here in France or Britain, which were colonialist countries. So I think this argument is a bit weak. If we had this kind of problems only in Britain, let's say Britain, France, Spain, and Portugal, we could say, okay, yeah, it's because we have been a colonialist country. But it's not the case, because you know it's true Germany had a little colonies before the First World War, so but it was not a colonial country. If they had colonies, Germans, it was in Eastern Europe, toward Ukraine, let's say. Yeah, they've been colonialist in Europe. By example, the Turks have colonies in in the European Balkans. So yeah, there are
Mm,
a lot of Japanese were colonialists too in Asia, in China, in
mm,
Philippines, and everywhere. But yes, but first, it's a long time since we have these colonies have been freed. It's 60 years now and even
mm,
more. So people who join us to come to Europe nowadays, they have never met any colonialists before because they are relatively young and the colonies are old. Maybe their grandfathers have been colonized, but not themselves or their own parents. So I don't think, but in a way, yes, I feel a bit embarrassed with your question because it's true that
mm.
the look we have on certain populations may be uh, shaped,
Shaped.
yes, that's it, by our old colonialist history. There
Mm,
is
mm,
something like that in it. Yeah, it's true that because
mm,
colonialist mind had a very racist basis. Because if you want to suppress freedom in another country, you have to think that the people living there are inferiors, which was, of course, a shame to think because some of these cultures local were extremely interesting, and we despite our ancestors despite them, and they were wrong. um, uh, but time has passed. It's like with Germany.
mm,
My father and my grandfather have been waging wars with the Germans, but it was
mm.
65 years or yeah, no, 75 years ago.
We,
Uh,
we moved on.
and time has passed. So I think it's the same thing.
Mm,
No, French and Germans are the best friends in Europe, and it's a very good thing. We
mm,
don't pass our time complaining about how horrible the Germans have been in this country. I
mm,
see that among the young generations in North Africa, by example, because I have many friends there, they tell me we are fed up with the legendary history made up by the Algerian government, especially because they failed
mm,
so much everything, and there are so much thieves in this country that the only thing they can rely on is the legend of the victor of the fight, the war against the French imperialists. But it was long
mhm.
ago, and now we are today.
Oh,
So yeah, there is something true in the fact that people coming from ex-colonies may feel a kind of disdain, disregard. That's right. We have to fight against it, of course, because it's precisely racism, but we don't have to exaggerate it too much.
Rodrigo, are we the descendants of colonialists, the continent of white
Mhm.
supremacy?
Yes, actually, I do agree with this, but I'm actually much more severe as well with your initial statement. First of all, of course it doesn't apply to Europe, and you mentioned, Brice, in your answer, Scandinavian countries that never had colonies. What about Central and Eastern Europe?
Hmm.
You know, when you read, for example, in one of the in one of the European Commission documents on racism, that we will improve education and knowledge on the historical, cultural causes of racism. Please understand that for a Baltic, or for a Pole, or for a Hungarian, who until recently never saw an African in their own country,
Mm,
they had zero relations with them, zero, and of course never colonies. This is a bad joke, and that really sparks a lot of grotesque
backlash. Yeah.
comments. Of course, how
Mm,
can take the how can you take the EU seriously if they don't even know, if they are stupid enough to write those things, ignoring like basic histories of the vast majorities of the European member
mm,
states? Because actually colonialism applies to a minority. And
mm,
then also, more on colonialism in general, what I what I'm very critical about the woke movement is that again, it's an anti-Western ideology. They hate themselves. It's basically white
mm,
liberal elites hating themselves and self-loathing, you know. And at the end, we have the impression that only whites colonized, only whites had slavery.
mm,
Hello, the Muslim civilization never colonized anyone.
mm,
So basically, they are the largest, arguably the largest religion in the world, but they never colonized anyone. The Dahomey Empire in
mm,
Africa never colonized anyone. The Japanese, as you said as well. I
mm,
mean, colony is the very history of humanity. Conquer, to conquer. That was basically like the driving force behind humanity for centuries and centuries and centuries.
mm,
And now, a very ignorant vision of history wants to make us believe that this is the monopoly of one civilization. Like, by the way, the same applies tel quel, mutatis mutandis, to slavery. Can we also speak, for example, about the Muslim slavery? Does that
mm,
exist or not? It still exists in some countries, by the way, today. And so, again, it's not so much the problem as of course, colonialism. Yeah, it was a bad thing. We can speak about it, but then we speak about it in every single country that committed them,
mm,
and not in this very, very Manichaean, black and white. Sorry for using those words, fashion, and.
mm,
And again, we can maybe speak also about discrimination and racisms in European societies. But let's not forget that European societies are probably the ones that have been most welcoming of foreigners in the last
mm,
70 years. I mean, I don't see any other example in the world except the US, again, a Western country, where
mm,
it was so easy to come and where people were welcomed from different cultures and from different latitudes. Do you think it's easy to
mm,
migrate for a European to the Gulf countries, for example, or
mm,
even to Africa or even to South America? No, it's not. So again, it's also very unfair that those who are heavily criticized are those actually who had the highest sense of hospitality. And so that's why there I must say that I totally disagree with this angle that we have a past that we need to debunk, that we need on which we need to feel guilty. If we are guilty of something, then the whole mankind is also guilty of exactly the same thing. We don't have the monopoly of defaults. I know the wokes would like us to be like that because they are so narcissists that they even think that only white people can be bad, but no,
mm.
it's not like that.
So no monopoly of guilt. I think it's fair to say you've mostly agreed so far. I want to push you a little bit further where I suspect you might not be fully in agreement. Um, let's talk about Hungary and Poland. Is it fair to say that the EU institutions have been making Hungary and Poland pay for their anti-woke policies on immigration, on LGBTQ issues? For example, some of the inquiries from the European Parliament were started by the Greens, who are one of the most kind of advanced green woke party in Europe. Do you think the EU institutions that make Hungary and Poland pay for these anti-woke policies, or on the contrary, do you think these governments are simply attacking traditional liberal values such as individual rights? Um, Rodrigo, do you think it is
Mhm.
possible within the EU to be anti woke without having a political cost?
What I think is happening now is that, again, as I explained at the beginning, there is a clear bet now from the current commission to move on the woke agenda. Huh? And I think the examples I gave at the beginning of this podcast speak for themselves. And there is also a tendency to confuse those with what we call the European common values that are embedded in Article 2 of the treaty.
Mm-hmm.
Article 2 of the treaty, I don't want to get too legal here, but if you read it, it's actually a very generic and vague concepts like non-discrimination, like the rule of law, like human rights in general, like equality between men and women, blah, blah. And again, there's also another thing that is important here is that normally the European Union is only competent, within its competences. So it doesn't go beyond. That's the Article 5, Principle of Conferral of Competences, which a lot of people seem to neglect in Brussels, in my view. And so here the problem is that, first of all, I don't like moral crusades that go beyond your competences. So when if you don't have, if it's not an EU competence, then sometimes the best answer you can give is, it's none of my business. Because again, imagine if one day you have a conservative commission, which I don't think will ever happen, but that is starting to give lessons, to teach lessons to Belgium or to the Netherlands on their euthanasia or on abortion or things like that, I really don't think is the business of the European Commission and of the European Union. So we need more a culture of subsidiarity here. And if some Western European countries don't like the conservative approach of Poland and Hungary, then I would tell them, look, too bad, but then wait until the Hungarians and the Poles change their government. They might do. It's called democracy. We also have to accept it like that. And again, so it's not they no longer have they don't have the competence to start with. And second, I think it's very, very dangerous indeed that you suddenly do an amalgamation and between the EU values, of Article 2, and a specific ideology that is at best very progressive and at worst very woke. Okay? And I think this is indeed that launches moral crusades, and actually that have concrete consequences, because today, as we speak, indeed, the funds of the this how do you call it in English? I forgot. Like this Fond de Relance, recovery fund of
Yeah,
the recovery
fund.
fund of the recovery fund actually are blocked for Hungary and Poland. What are the reasons behind? Officially, is the rule of law and the corruption. Well, I have my doubts, and I have my doubts, for example, because I don't think that a commissioner like Helena Dalli, who just launched those guidelines, has the legitimacy now to launch an infringement procedure against Hungary on their law on the protection of minors, which basically says we don't want gender theory and homosexuality to be portrayed for minors. It might be shocking for some Western European minds, but again, I think this is within their competences, as this is definitely within the circle of respectability. I don't want the European Union to become a progressive only political club. I think this might even kill it.
Brice, what do you make of this idea that the EU has become a only progressive club, which ends up being hostile to anti-woke government, so to speak?
Well, for the first time, I think I'm going to disagree with Rodrigo. I think what we why the reason why we blamed Poland and Hungarian governments, it's not because they're anti-woke thing, which I support completely, but because they became illiberal democracies, as Orban himself said. We are a club of liberal democracies, which means that we separate powers. By example, we don't want that judiciary power will be under the hand of the executive power. This is what Europe is about. United States too, and Orban disagree with that. He thinks that separation of power is not something European. He thinks that when you've got a majority in the parliament, you can do anything you want, including closing down journals or magazines or medias. He put a kind of kleptocracy in his own country with all his friends taking positions in the business. This is a very bad thing for Hungary. In Poland, the situation is a bit different and not so much worrying for liberal people like me, but still it's annoying. It's not about woke. It's about liberal democracy again. Liberal democracy means that you have to um, prepare the that you have to be ready to lose the power and not doing everything to keep it at any cost. And I think what Orban has done, we are not Russia. We don't want a kind of Putin style of government. And I'm afraid that certain leaders in Central Europe may be tempted, maybe think that they can behave the way Putin has done. In our countries, leaders are um, um, are supposed to prepare the possibility that the opposition could win the power. That's the way it is. That's the way democracy behaves and functions. And I'm not sure that Orban is on this line at all. That's my point.
Rodrigo, we don't want to be too greedy on your time, so do let us know. But Rodrigo, if you want to bounce on what Brice said, go ahead.
Yes, let me just react to that. Just no later than today. Today, the Hungarian Constitutional Court ruled totally against the Orban government on a migration issue. And by the way, it was also a story of primacy of European law. So, what I think we don't need many more examples to show actually that there is a real independence of the judiciary. I mean, in a real dictatorship, believe me, the government doesn't lose the capital. So it's not governed, it's not ruled by the opposition. The constitutional court doesn't rule against the government. And actually, in a real dictatorship, I live in Budapest, I wouldn't get every day on my news feed news against the government, and sometimes even against the family, or even against the grandchildren of the prime minister. So again, there I think there are a lot of myths there that can be totally debunked within 1 week in visiting Hungary. I was in Poland so 3 days ago, and I think just like sometimes a little cure of reality can help. And indeed, yes, I think I'm a Westerner, I'm a Western European who lives here, and I don't see even 10% of what I heard when I was in Brussels. So I think there as well, there's maybe it's not a problem of wokeism, but it might be also a problem of deep misinformation. But coming back to the wokeism, which is the idea, I think this one is really crystallized in the controversy between Hungary and the European Union on the law on the protection of minors. And there, when I read the infringement that the Commission launched against Hungary, with unclear competences, again, I insist on that, but one of the questions, the main point was Hungary failed to prove that exposing minors to this content is actually harmful. There, I clearly see, I clearly see that the Commission is embracing this woke ideology, and again, and when you link it to the expression common values, and you link the expression common values to conditionality of funds, this is where I think we can get very, very far. Again, don't underestimate how shocking some policies in Western Europe can be. Let me choose one about in France, for example. Now in France, recently, I think the parliament adopted basically like the type of abortion that has no deadline, that knows no deadlines for social distress or something like that. I don't know exactly the details, something like that. Well, you might be shocked or not. It's a French decision. It's not for the European Union to intervene there. And again, one more thing is that look at the laïcité, the French laïcité, which is a concept that Brice previously described in details, that is difficult for understand for non-French. It's difficult to understand for a non-French that a mother with a veil cannot accompany a class to the zoo, for example. It's difficult. I do understand it. I do fully share it, but it can be difficult for the others. And then sometimes I'm wondering that if we continue on that slippery slope of preaching on values, that the next target uh, of the EU political correctness might be the French laicity. We already had one warning with the campaign, the hijab, the happy hijab campaign. What's next? When Macron 1 year ago pronounced his very courageous speech in Les Mureaux on October 2020, when he spoke about Islamist separatism, how did the Anglo-Saxon press react to that? He was Islamophobic. He was only Islamophobic, and the Financial Times said he was Islamophobic. The New Woke Times obviously said he was Islamophobic, and the Washington Woke as well. All of them said the same thing. And at the end, this is what mysteriously, surprise, surprise, the European Union seemed to repeat as well through this campaign. So again, we should be very, very careful, because it's to blithely judge some other countries, and actually the next one to be judged might be you. So again, I believe in a European Union where that strictly sticks to its competences, and that is a real place for diversity. I like this word diversity because it's very ironic. Those speaking about diversity all the time think it's sexual diversity, ethnic diversity, size diversity, is any type of diversity except the one that really matters, which is intellectual diversity.
Yeah. Well, Rodrigo, you seem to argue that the EU's moving against Poland and Hungary is just another instance of this woke drift to cancel dissent, and I think that, yeah,
Partially,
and I think
partially, yes.
this may well be the sort of the very last point, the only point on which you two will disagree, and I think we'll have to agree to disagree here on this last point. But it's, as old school liberals, I think we should be comfortable with disagreement. And one of the more noxious effects of woke culture is that it muzzles dissent, and it sort of flattens opinion. So I think it's a testament to the spirit of this podcast that we're ending on a note of disagreement. So thank you both so much for joining us. This has been,
and by the way, if I may, it's just beautiful to disagree, and it's
I agree to disagree.
it's a woke thing not to disagree. It's beautiful to disagree, and this is what made us strong also in the last centuries, because we were able to disagree with elegance.
Exactly. And thank you so much for joining us on this very rich conversation. We set out to examine whether and why the EU institutions have fallen prey to woke ideology, and we were incredibly privileged to be joined by Rodrigo. You are the director of the Center for European Studies at Mathias Corvinus Collegium in Budapest, and Brice Couturier, you're a best-selling author and journalist. Your latest book is Ok Millenials, Puritanism, Victimization, Tdentitarianism, Censorship, a study of a baby boomer on the myths of the woke generation. Thank you both for joining us.
Yeah, I know. Last episode of the season, very, very, very impressed by the work we've been putting, Jorge. So kudos to both of us. A very interesting conversation between, I think, someone who is more of a conservative and someone who's more of a liberal, and we saw that kind of disagreement towards the end. But what I think they both spotted is that woke thinking can be at times seemingly very incoherent, and that's why when we talk about the TERF movement, about J.K. Rowling being a feminist, but not being feminist enough for her to be saved. And I think why this is happening is because there is some kind of coherence despite that apparent disagreement. The coherence is we need to break down the norm. We need to break down what is the norm within a society. And to that extent, I think the figure of the trans has been a much more radical concept, a concept which is much more useful to deconstruct the norm than this concept. And what Rodrigo said is, I think what unites this movement is a hate of Rodrigo said a hate of kind of the West. Brice is a liberal, so he said a hate of liberal societies. But either way, the coherence is in the thing they oppose. And what is really interesting, this is where we wrote an article in the American Mind last November called the Woke Islamist Nexus. And the reason we wrote this is because I was quite struck when I read a communique from Erdogan, president of Turkey, where he essentially sounded like some kind of woke student activist, where he said that Europe was being structurally racist and all those kind of buzzwords I've only really heard on American campuses and increasingly in European campuses, all of a sudden were recycled under the pen of Erdogan. Whether that's cynical, I do not know, but he kind of understands this kind of fault, and he can make an alliance, objective alliance, where those people who also have for enemy of a West or liberal democracy, depending whether you're more of a conservative, more of a liberal. Yeah, and I think there's another interesting moment in this conversation, which was when Brice started talking about how the Macron government has been staunchly anti-woke. Um, I don't know. Macron has his moments. At times, he is indeed very clearly anti-woke, and his fight against the New York Times, against the FT op-ed on Islamism, where he punched back against. All of these are examples of a Macron government being kind of based, if you wanted to use the anti-woke parlance. But he's not very clear on those topics. Rodrigo talked about white privilege, how Macron defended or said there was a white privilege. And I think white privilege is one of the most toxic concepts, because the reason I do not like this word at all, there might be some discriminations against non-white people. I don't disagree with that. But the problem with white privilege is the idea that the way white people are treated, aka not being discriminated by the police, not being discriminated to find housing or stuff like that, it's the idea that that kind of behavior is actually a privilege. And you know what we do with privileges? We abolish them. We abolish privileges. And I refuse the idea that the way normal people should be treated in normal society should be seen under the lens of privilege. It is not a privilege. There is what is happening is people are not treated equally. But that does not mean the way white people are treated is a privilege. There is no advantage given to white people in the sense there is some kind of privilege that we should be